Hello and welcome. My oh my, that was some trippy hold music. All it was missing was some jazz flute. I'm Emmet Ryan. I am the editor of Connected in the Business Post, and I am welcoming you today to what I'm hoping will be, and I'm pretty confident will be, a lively session here on subscription economy consuming cloud services. And welcome along to this beautiful virtual environment we're all in. And I've got four great guests with me to talk to you this morning, and then we'll have a great Q&A session afterwards. But before I introduce my four wonderful guests, a quick reminder. This session is very much for you. So start getting your questions through now, and we'll come to as many as we can during the Q&A portion later in the session. With that out of the way, I'd like to introduce you to my four guests this morning. They are Kelvin Murray, Senior Threat Researcher at Webroot, Mike Pensival, Channel Account Manager UK and Ireland at WatchGuard, Josh Bregman, Cyglass, and Liviu Arsene, Global Security Researcher at Bitdefender. And we've got four great talks from the four lads coming up for you all. Remember, though, keep those questions coming in. Our first talk is from Kelvin. He's going to be talking about MSPs, cybercrime's biggest earner. Obviously, one that's very much on the discussion right now. Without further ado, here's Kelvin.
Hi, Emmett. Thank you for that introduction. And thanks everybody else for joining me for talking about the subscription economy. The funny thing about my presentation is that you'll see the subscription economy is really not just a case of something for the business world. It's a case for the cybercrime world as well. So it's a business model that cyber criminals have embraced just as much as the rest of us. Okay, so when we do straw polls and when we talk to admins and we talk to business owners, the number one thing that we see people freaking out about, the number one thing that keeps people awake at night is ransomware. And if you've seen what's happened in 2020, that's for very, very good reason indeed. From the top level, these are the current criminal strategies we're seeing. We're seeing a constant targeting of what we would call weak targets. So that's healthcare, government, transport, education, and SMB. We've seen a lot of healthcare targets in the news now at the moment. As you can imagine, for obvious reasons this year, we have seen education in particular being affected this year. Schools are really the poor relation of all of these type of targets. Schools might have the kind of complexity of an SMB, but they wouldn't have nearly as much money and they wouldn't have nearly as much skills and organization. Governments, for obvious reasons, very, very big, very hard to manage, much like, say, a hospital. And when you look at something like healthcare, government, transport, and education, they are what's called essential services. If you have somebody's heart surgery is about to be coming online, if you have SATs or Leaving Cert, things that are happening, all of these, if you hit them with a ransomware attack, they're very essential businesses. So with that kind of leverage comes money. But what makes more money than all of them? SMBs, and that's easily the case. In 2020 and in the second half of 2019, we've seen a move by criminals, not just to kind of rinse SMBs like they always had, but to go after big game hunting. And what do we mean by that? Well, we just mean big targets. So going after Norsk Hydro, hitting people for maybe ransoms that might be 50 million. The type of gangs that do these are really, really specialized criminal gangs. And they're not your average hacker sitting at home with a laptop. And as you can see there, just a recent report, all of this targeting and all this specialization and all this move towards privatization between ransomware gangs has led to growing ransoms. So Coveware came out with those stats. Coveware are actually a company that liaise between you and your ransomware, your ransom criminals. So they're there to negotiate a settlement between you and the ransomware criminals. So just the very nature that Coveware exists and thrive as a company should tell you everything you need to know. Last year, we saw 100,000 was the average ransom. I thought that was absolutely nuts because back in the day, we used to see $100 ransom with the earliest CryptoLocker ransomware. But with the report that just came out 2 weeks ago, Coveware announced that the average has gone up to 233K or more. And as you can see there, a very recent ransomware attack, the top one I've seen, and I could be wrong about this, is 35 million, 34 million. We have seen, when we talk about a subscription economy, we've seen a move by ransomware criminals to go to ransomware as a service business model. So you get all of these guys and they come up with these top level things of how to hack the military, how to hack businesses, really high-end businesses. But the majority of the money is being made by SMB. So how do you do that? You sell off your expertise. You sell off your expertise in coding. You sell off your expertise in how to crack a business. You sell off pre-hacked businesses online, etc. And you sell them off to a smaller guy, a smaller outfit, criminal outfit. They take all this free expertise off you. They go hack somebody and then they give you a cut. And that's the ransomware as a service business model. Probably something that's going to hit SMBs more than anything else. A big breakout thing we've seen this year, and one of the reasons why we've seen a rise in ransoms, is what we were calling a double threat. So where a criminal would steal your data first, then encrypt all of your files, then you might stick your thumb up to them and say, well, I'm not giving you a penny, we've got backups, but they have all of your data, and then they try to release that data online. So it's a way of just leveraging a company and putting a company to ransom on the double. Of course, this year we've seen COVID and other hot button headlines like, you know, the elections in the US, etc. Quite interesting, actually. We did a report for Forbes. We've seen that Spotify, YouTube, Netflix, all of these things, we're seeing them up hundreds or even thousands of % in our phishing. So anything that's a hot button headline, or even if it's the case that everyone's moving to work on the couch these days, that's what leads cyber criminals to adapt. And we've seen a lot of shared infrastructure, as in criminals is sharing resources with themselves, or the big criminals like the emo tech gangs, like the trickbot gangs, sharing resources between themselves. We've also seen as well this headline through the year: first death reported on a ransomware following a ransomware attack in a German hospital. That was reported as the first death. I originally thought that this was a bit of kind of silly coverage, because hospitals have been attacked loads throughout the year and major disruption has been caused. So if somebody died in an hour, or somebody died in a day earlier than they should have, I thought this focus on a one death was pretty silly, considering the amount of attacks on hospitals throughout the last few years. As it turns out, there's doubt now maybe that directly led to it, but I don't think it's ransomware has cost lives in my book, 100%. Oh, and one more thing I would say as well: when we say it's privatized and competitive, if you're a country maybe that wants to attack another country, there's no point in getting your own spies involved and then hiring your own spies to take care of the criminals in your own country. Why not leave a privatized and competitive model and tell them what to do, and tell them to take as much money from your enemies? So yeah, that's another kind of murky subheadline to all of this. This should give you an idea of how healthy ransomware is. This is from ID Ransomware, and that's an excellent site used by researchers. So this time 3 years ago, we had 300 names in it, and at the end of September, it was 955, and there's probably more since then. Yeah, as of today, the 16th of November, this number has gone up. It's not every ransomware in the world, but it gives you an idea of what we're dealing with. Crazy amount of money out there is really driving criminal innovation. So if you're going to have a targeted attack on a business, the days of sending out 1 million emails and hoping somebody clicks on them are over when it comes to ransomware. Part of the targeted business model involves seeking out unsecured remote desktop protocols, or RDP. RDP, for those who don't know, is used by everybody really who has a kind of a Microsoft setup, and it's used usually by admins to connect usually to servers. What's bad about this is it was the number one reason why businesses got exploited for the last nearly a decade, I would say, when it comes to ransomware. Well, since ransomware has been out, less than that. But since the move to everybody working from home, there's more people working from their couches, more people connected to machines. Your IT admins aren't in the office. So we've seen the price of already hacked machines on the dark web, which you can pick up for just a few dollars. We've seen that price go down. And yeah, RDP is, I couldn't believe it, but RDP is even being more exploited today than it has been. Just taking a look at one of these big game hunters, or one of these big gangs, we're just going to take a look at the Maze gang here. So Maze, what it does is it threatens to publish huge amount of data. It brazenly does this from legitimate kind of websites that are from non-dark URLs, I should say, like that dark URL there. Don't worry, it's down. And it just simply has too much valuable information on its victims, and it has access to too many hacked machines that they don't have time to use all this data and leverage it all. So what this cartel did is they set up an affiliate model, and they had other smaller criminals getting onto them. So it's a big gang inviting people into a membership program. They pay this Maze gang for access to the membership, and then they get access to, they obviously give the Maze gang a cut as well. Maze, since their job is to taunt you and to say, we have all of your data and we're going to release all your data, as they did to poor LG there, they're very public facing, they're very PR savvy. So they crack a lot of jokes, a lot of memes, and they claim to have a conscience, like when they attacked an army base that recently had a shooting at it, or when they attacked socially significant services, such as a hospital recently. They're saying we don't attack these hospitals, but we have seen them doing this in the past as well. And really, because they're such a public-facing criminal gang, they want to liaise with you. They want to liaise with other criminals. They kind of want to show that they have a conscience. So these are just some of the programming tactics and tricks. I'm not going to go through many of them. Things like process whitelisting, sandbox evasion, region whitelisting, machine whitelisting. All of that is to avoid researchers like myself looking at the files anyway. Or sometimes it's avoid to doing criminal acts on your own doorstep as well. A big breakout thing we've seen this year is multi-thread encryption. So this just makes that encryption so much quicker. Whereas before, the encryption might have taken a few hours, now it takes much less of the time by using multiple threads. Very closely tied into ransomware, and the other biggie that we see as far as malware goes is data theft. So most obvious ways the most obvious reasons to steal data is for fast cash. So you're talking about bank and Trojan stealing, credit cards, Bitcoins, banking credentials, all of that juicy stuff you can just turn into a quick profit. However, most people don't steal credit cards individually. They go onto the dark web and they fence them off, maybe by the thousands, maybe by the tens of thousands. The same can be done as well with criminal information. You can use those credit cards to do crime. You can impersonate somebody yourself, but you're better off fencing that in the dark web and leaving it off to somebody else. Of course, there's all kinds of corporate, political, and military espionage, especially more and more we're seeing espionage with regards to research in the third level education sphere. And the number one thing that we deal with really is when data is stolen as a means to attack. So it's data that isn't instantly lucrative to a thief. Like you could steal gemstones out of a jeweler's, but really the blueprints for the jeweler's or the key code for the door, even though it has no intrinsic value, it has value as a means of attack. So what are we talking about there? We're talking about credentials and passwords easily found on the dark web, reconnaissance malware, etc., like Emotet and like TrickBot. So when we talk about what steals data in the world, it really doesn't get bigger than TrickBot on the malware front. TrickBot is a top bank and Trojan used by big cybercrime gangs. When we say big gangs, as I said before, it's not a guy sitting at home with a laptop. The kind of gangs that run these and the kind of gangs that run Maze, for instance, these guys have a good 9 to 5. They drive into work. They probably have targets to hit, and they probably have HR departments, and they have everything. These guys are top professionals. And when you think about what these kind of gangs are doing, they're stealing banking credentials. When you steal banking credentials, you have to use physical money mills to launder that money. You have to have a global criminal network when it comes to rinsing out all of these accounts. As far as what this banking Trojan steals, everything. Data, banking details, cryptocurrency, network topography, infected device information, online account, passwords, cookies, web histories, login credentials, you name it. And TrickBot as well as stealing all of this stuff and bringing it back to the criminals has also in the last couple of years been dropping ransomware, such as Bitdefender and such as Ryuk. And if you think about it, really, you'll have Emotet, say, infecting all of your machines on the network. You'll have Emotet dropping TrickBot to steal all the money from the network. And then you have TrickBot dropping ransomware. And the order of things is important because if they were to encrypt all of the files on a network with the ransomware first and then try to steal the data, it wouldn't really work like that. So yeah, I guess this is a triple threat. You could see it compared to the double threat that we talked about before. All right. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is business email compromise attacks. For those who don't know what BEC is, you kind of know what it is without me telling you. Really, it's the oldest trick in the book. You get in contact with somebody and you ask them to send you the cash. I usually talk about a criminal case here from a year or two ago involving a Kenyan gang targeting the University of San Diego. But since this happened yesterday, I might as well talk about this instead. This is the Leviathan, a capital hedge fund, and it was forced into closure only yesterday or thereabouts from an attack that happened in September. So they were sent an email with a fake Zoom link. Somebody clicked on this. As you can imagine, Zoom links, the fake Zoom links have gone up this year because Zoom is incredibly useful for people. We're using it now at the moment. Got hit with a fake Zoom link. Malware ended up on their machines. The malware compromised more email accounts. Dodgy emails with fake invoices were sent around, and lots of checks and balances weren't followed by this hedge fund. These hedge funds were absolutely huge, but what happened to them is they lost their biggest client then, Australian Catholic Super. And once they withdrew their money after hearing about this, these two guys here, Michael Fagan and his Michael Brooks here had to close down the Leviathan Capital, which had 75 million under management before the attack. Now, the strange thing about this is it's not the strange thing about this previous example I have is the bad guys actually got caught. This is more of a typical case. This will not get caught. And if you're the likes of Google that maybe get hit by an attack with this, you have more likelihood of law enforcement going after it just because it's a lot more money. If you're a small to medium business, or even if you're just a consumer, the likelihood of getting people to look after this and the likelihood of catching these criminals is just so small. But don't take my word for it how bad of a threat it is. There's AIG cyber claims from their EMEA saying it was the worst thing they'd seen in mid 2019. They have repeated that again. Similar from around the same time from the FBI, and Agari with a more recent one in just last month, September of this year, saying that they've soared in Q2 as they had in Q1 as well. Okay, so a big integral part of the money that criminal made, as we said, are SMBs, and a big integral part of the SMB story, as everybody knows, is MSPs. According to the Federation of Small Businesses, there's 5.9 million SMBs in the UK in 2019, and they make up over 99% of all businesses in Britain. And the vast majority, even though you'll never ever see it in the headlines, you'll only see the big companies being hit. The vast majority of all businesses, the vast majority of criminal money is being made on SMBs. And as you know for yourselves, MSP clientele is almost all SMBs. So the complexity of doing business today, I was talking with a teacher recently. They just have one IT guy in their school, and he's clearly not doing a good job, anecdotally, from what she's telling me. But the complexity of doing business today, configuring emails, setting them up, password management, running a website, it's hard enough to run a business and to organize a business on your own without having to secure it as well. To simply get things organized and managed to where you can run business is one level of complexity, and then adding security in on that is really nasty on top of it. Sadly, since 2017, we've seen MSP attacks become serious. So if we say breaching an SMB makes the most amount of money, how do you breach as many SMBs as you can in the one time? And that's by attacking an MSP. Gangs out there exist that completely specialize in MSP breaching. And I guess they're a form of supply side attacks. So we've even seen AV companies, getting attacked. We've seen common things like CCleaner getting attacked as well. And the type of people that do supply side attacks are the creme de la creme. They're the elite kind of hacking groups out there. MSP tech and tactics are being monitored. If an MSP is maybe a little bit slow in pushing out a certain RMM, or if there's have used kind of bad tactics, if they've done it for one company, they might have done it for other companies as well. So it's something that criminals do watch. And yeah, this is following reports by Tetris Science. That's a US Secret Service as well, which is a very recent report, just highlighting the threat of MSP attacks. MSPs thankfully tend to be really on top of their game. They tend to be the smartest guys out there, but it's in the SMB's hands to work with their MSP to get secure, and it's in the SMB's hands to not only secure themselves but to secure SMBs as well. Because let's face it, it is a really tricky business. Okay, I don't know how I'm doing for time here, but yeah, these are the last things I'll say. When it comes to bolstering security, don't be overwhelmed. There's so much stuff out there to secure, but it's good to just start somewhere. If I could give you one piece of advice, it would be, for heaven's sake, secure your RDP, please. And then if you just do things like secure RDP and passwords, just those things alone will probably be enough to raise a business out of being low-hanging fruit. Multiple backups, obviously, strong password policies, please multi-factor authentication when you can. Train and test staff. It's one thing to train staff, but some people can fall asleep with PowerPoints. Training your staff and keeping them on their toes is really important. And definitely start at the top. It's very often CEOs, IT admins, and even so-called experts like myself, we have a tendency to just brush things aside and think that we're above it all. CEOs, when it comes to BEC scams, IT admins, when it comes to RDP, if you breach kind of a lower level worker in a business, you can only so much damage can happen. If you breach these guys, the whole business could fall overnight. And of course, the old tactics like disable what you're not using and update absolutely everything. Okay, so I think that's it for me. Please get your questions in if you have any for me, and thanks a lot for listening.
And thanks very much to Kelvin for that great presentation there. And remember, folks, those questions are really, really important. Keep them coming in, keep firing away. I've already got a couple I've jotted down myself. I'm going to ask Kelvin later on. And my next guest is Mike Pensival. He is the channel account manager at WatchGuard. And Mike is going to be talking about cyber threat protection from endpoint and network using a layered approach to security. Mike, welcome aboard and show us what you got.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. Great presentation, Kelvin. Number of themes we're going to see, I suspect, through all the presentations this morning. And I've been asked to step in at the last minute for my boss, as happens on these occasions, to talk to you a little bit about the threats that WatchGuard see in the wild, in real life examples. Some of the top themes that we see running through businesses, and therefore how you can defend yourself against them in your businesses with which you work. And we're going to start with some threat landscape statistics that come from a couple sources. So first of all, every device that we deploy around the world where the customer allows us to, we capture anonymized data about what we're seeing in the wild, and that helps us evolve our solutions to be able to protect businesses, to be able to protect your clients and protect your MSP business. And the first one that steps up there is how these malicious actors, how these bad guys are using our own technology against us. And this statistic is literally the last 30 days of traffic that we saw as of just a couple nights ago, and specific to the UK as well. So we saw that 82% of the traffic that hit our devices that we were trying to deal with the threats that we're seeing was as a result of some kind of zero-day exposure. Now, we can combine that with some of the statistics that we see through something called our Internet Security Report, which we publish every quarter, where we're seeing a push towards encrypted traffic as well. And this was mentioned in Kelvin's presentation, where more and more traffic is becoming encrypted, and even the bad guys are using those methods that we use to protect ourselves in order to prevent them from being detected. So we need devices that are going to ensure that we can inspect that traffic, and that requires faster and more sophisticated devices in which to be able to do so. But as we say, they're using the methods that we use to protect ourselves against us and exploiting these zero-day threats as we see them. Now, of those threats that we see coming through the businesses, there are five that, a couple of which have already been mentioned, that we're going to try to address. And if we do these, we're going to prevent something like 95% of the attacks coming against businesses and against your clients, and indeed you as MSPs at this time. And it starts with the very first one, number one, to by every report we've seen for a couple of years now. It starts with some kind of phishing attack. So the phishing attack, as we've mentioned, are those BEC type attacks that Kelvin just mentioned. They're ones where emails come in and they're trying to capture some data or deliver some kind of payload at the endpoint. Now, typically, what we're seeing is that these are orientated around what we call those with elevated credentials. Kelvin mentioned this at the end. If you can compromise somebody who has some kind of elevated credentials, whether it be a system admin, CEO, etc., then you get what I call the keys to the kingdom. Because if we breach somebody at a low level within a business, they'll have minimal access. Probably the data to which they're exposed is less sensitive. But as we work our way up through an organization and migrate from what would be just the shotgun style phishing approach to the spear phishing, where we're trying to target individuals, then we start capturing high grade intelligence, usually credentials, The transition we've seen, particularly in 2020, with everybody moving to remote services and more cloud services, is Office 365 is one of the ones we're very much seeing targeted, where we can capture information about those with elevated credentials to subsequently exploit them either with a piece of ransomware. But what's more likely is we're going to try and capture the username and password, something quite straightforward. And what we're also seeing is how the bad actors that we see in this space are particularly targeting social media as well. So if nobody wants to admit to this, but most of us use a range of passwords across multiple types of solutions because we can't hold all those passwords in our heads at any time. And whilst the password managers out there that will help you with that, it's quite likely that you use the same password for your Facebook account, your LinkedIn account, and perhaps your AD credentials, or at least some of us do. Not everybody will admit to it, but there tends to be, usually in people's heads, somewhere between 6 and 9 sets of passwords that will rotate in some variation or not. And if we can capture that through a weakened system, then we might be able to use it in a business system. And the opportunity that represents is one, either to extort the business through a piece of ransomware, or perhaps worse, steal some kind of intellectual property so that can be resold on the dark side of the internet. The second one is it won't go away. Ransomware, we've just heard, it still continues to be one of the big money makers for these organizations. And we've got WannaCry up here because it's still the best known in the world, and particularly in the UK. I was actually in an NHS site when it hit, which was quite interesting, seeing people run around with their hair on fire and almost putting axes, like the films, putting access through those cables in the wall, but trying to deal with this as it exploited them. And there are still a number of organizations that perhaps haven't put all the measures in place. But this is still on the rise, but just at the tail end of 2019, credential theft overtook ransomware as the #1 type of breach, but we can't ignore it. And it's becoming more and more sophisticated in its delivery methods. In that, one of the ways that we're seeing it happen is on the next evolution, which is what we call fileless malware. So traditional security measures are really focused around inspecting documents, inspecting files as they come in, usually through email. But there are, as we know, there are many other methods within into a business, particularly with more and more remote workers at the moment, whether it be a USB stick or something sent over a chat window, some kind of social media integration. We're seeing more and more of these inject malicious code into processes, into memory, rather than within the document itself. And this enables these malicious actors to subvert some of the more traditional security measures that we perhaps put in place. So we've needed to evolve those technologies in order to be able to deal with them, both on the endpoint and at the network layer, so that we can examine them appropriately, so that we can look beyond the obvious. And we need to use next generation type technology, such as heuristic, algorithm, AI-driven AV type solutions that can look in excess of 4,000 characteristics of a payload, that something a person could never do and a signature never will, because they're evolving almost on a day-to-day basis. So we need to be careful that we put the appropriate measures in place to be able to do this. And typically, they're going to exploit some kind of vulnerability within the computer itself, often as what we call a zero-day attack, as we saw at the beginning of these. And they'll often use technology such as PowerShells and scripts, which your user will be expecting to run, may even get a warning at the top of the window saying, do you trust this source? Are you going to allow these things to run? But unfortunately, what they're trying to do is they're being stealthy within the environment, within the endpoint, to try and capture information that they can then reuse at a later date. Because what we've seen is the reason ransomware is on the decline and the more authentication or credentials are on the rise is that the longer a piece of malware, a longer a piece and a breach can be in place, the more valuable it becomes because it's gathering more and more data. So gone are the days where skull and crossbones appear on your screen and they're just saying they've given you a bad weekend, they want to extort money out from you. The longer they can stay there, the more likely they are to be able to capture information. Think about things like credit card data that they might try to steal. Clearly, the longer it stays stealthy, the longer it has a backdoor to your network and can capture that information, the more credentials it's going to capture, the more sensitive data, which they can sell at a later date to make more money. So we need to be very careful about what kind of measures that we put in place. And specifically, as I think we've said already, it was certainly at the end of Kelvin's presentation, and I've mentioned before, account takeover is the number one thing that people are trying to achieve. So the idea that we can just use usernames and passwords at the moment, and the idea that RDP is still a vulnerability scares the life out of anybody in IT security, in that you can use fairly traditional measures to be able to attack RDP type sessions, brute force attacks, password spraying, as we're saying, using massive dictionaries of commonly used passwords are really tools that shouldn't be available and could be launched against an organization, can be very quickly fixed by introducing technology such as multi-factor authentication. Two-factor has kind of gone away these days. Please don't tell me you're using SMS anymore. We've all seen all sorts of ways in which that's been breached, even with those that are already using it. But with the user community has shown a certain reluctance in implementing MFA. But the way I talk to my clients about it, it's important enough with your personal money. Why isn't it important enough with your business data? It should be. We can protect multiple systems at once with one simple application across lots and lots of environments. And it doesn't need to be just about your Active Directory, your login credentials. It can go beyond that to your cloud-based services as well. And you can actually deliver services that make it easier for remote workers by implementing solutions such as that, where an MFA solution, you can log on to a portal and be presented with the number of resources available and have a single sign-on experience. You're actually making it easier for those remote workers that aren't in the office at the moment, whilst protecting the business for less than a cup of coffee per month. It is the number one thing you can do to protect yourself. And finally, we've still got those remote workers out there, so they're continuing to grow. There are a number of things that I've been working with colleagues more recently about how those remote workers have exploits that we're not really considering before. We're using cloud Wi-Fi, we're using public Wi-Fi, and we don't know how secure that is. We're using remote services that we perhaps haven't gone through the same amount of testing. And what I am seeing is a number of offices downsizing. So I talk to quite a lot of clients at the moment who talk about what they're going to do when we get out the other side of this pandemic. And I don't think anybody believes that we're going to get back to full offices again. Earlier this year, a couple of months into this pandemic, I went down to a business park on the M4 corridor, which is usually rammed full of, the usual saloon cars and BMWs and the like for most businesses. And the car park was empty. It was maybe 10% full. And businesses are up for sale. The days of using offices such as Regis and others, where you might just take us a little bit of space, but you don't know what the security is in that organization, or even downsizing your office to get a better work-life balance. We need to make sure that security remains where it needs to be, irrespective of your business size, so that we can address these 5 threats as we've identified them. Now, specifically, the evolving threats that we need to do, we need to look at endpoint all the way through Wi-Fi and think about users rather than thinking about devices. I think it's really, really important now that we consider what a user needs to be able to do their job, whether it be remotely, whether it be in the office. We need to make systems available to them, and we need to protect those connections that are available to them. And we can do that through a number of measures. That might be perimeter security. It might be evolving the endpoint to be more sophisticated to be able to deal with those zero-day threats. But old cliche of layered security hasn't gone away. Layered security is a cliche for a reason. They usually are. And the more layers you can put in there to prevent a malicious actor from being able to breach your business, the more likely you are to prevent information from leaking. And there's something called the kill chain, which I'm sure all the presenters here are familiar with. And it was developed by McDonnell Douglas a number of years ago that identified the common steps in trying to breach an organization, whether it be to steal data or whether it be to launch an exploit within that business. And the more of these steps that we can breach, the more likely we are to be able to protect a business and protect the information that are within it. And the kind of technologies that we're looking at to be able to protect a business are the likes of the regular ones, what used to be called the old UTM suite, still preventing people from going to websites that they shouldn't. Still security by traditional measures is important, but we need to extend that into the next generation type protection, using the likes of DNS services to prevent phishing campaigns, to prevent users from remote working but connecting to devices and to sites that they shouldn't, using the likes of AI technology to investigate files quickly and easily and look for those, perhaps those memory injections, those process injections on the endpoint. And the benefit of working with a vendor that has end-to-end solutions is that one of the biggest challenges is having this single pane of glass, this ability to be able to see into the endpoint, see into the user, and see into the perimeter with one solution that can cover all. And that's really where we think that layered security has the most benefit. And with that, I'd like to say thank you and welcome the next presenter.
Thanks very much, Mike, for that great presentation. And like I said, after Kelvin, please keep your questions coming in. I've got a couple lined up here for Mike after that as well. And our next speaker, though, is Josh Bregman, who is from Cyglass. And Josh, welcome along. Thanks for joining us. And Josh's discussion today is who's on my network? The journey to defending the hybrid cloud. So please, Josh, take the floor, or the virtual floor as it is.
Thanks, Emmett. Mike, Kelvin, great presentations. Tough act to follow, but I'll do my best. Good morning. Well, I guess good day, everyone. I'm joining you from Boston, Massachusetts. So my name is Josh Bregman. I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at Cyglass. I'm old now. I've been doing this for about over 25 years. Long sort of background in identity access management, cybersecurity. So really excited to be here at the Renaissance event. Thanks to Mike Conway and the team. Really like this event. Sad that it's virtual this year. Would like to be in Dublin again. But anyways, so who's Cyglass? So Cyglass is, we've been in business for about 15 years. The history of the company is it came out of U.S. government research in finding anomalies in weather patterns for fighter jets, so that when fighter jets are flying around, they wouldn't fly into low pressure systems. About 7 years ago, the U.S. government asked us to start researching, finding anomalies in computer networks. I joined about 4 years ago as part of a team that was taking this technology to the commercial market. And we did that for a few years. And just in March, we got acquired by Nominet. I'm not sure if people are familiar with Nominet, but Nominet's based out of the UK. They run the .uk domain registrar. Nominet also has got a large cybersecurity footprint in the UK. They're part of the UK's active cyber defense, the PDNS. And Cyglass was acquired to be their US cybersecurity presence. And I would say the things were going great. We got sort of acquired in March and had great plans for the business. And then, COVID hit. But before I get into COVID and the impact of Cyglass, let me show you a video. So please play the video. thanks for that. Hopefully that played all right for everybody. So as I said, that was the plan for the business as we got, came into March, and then, sadly, COVID hit. And, Cyglass is a network-based control. We're pulling traffic up into the cloud from firewalls, finding anomalies and detecting and blocking threats. And then we had a number of challenges here, right? So this is the Gartner view of what happens in a crisis. And what we saw initially was the reduction in staff, the closing of businesses like Mike talked about. The main motion in the business was remote working. So everybody's buying Office 365, everybody's moving to VPNs. And that's what happened really in the spring, summer. And then into sort of phase 2, trying to really figure out like what to do next. And this is a real challenge for Cyglass as a business. The sort of network perimeter was disappearing rapidly, and everybody was accelerating to the cloud. And so it really made us rethink how we were going to address the challenges that small and medium businesses were having. So I think our esteemed panel has covered a number of these things. Remote working. So the biggest thing about remote working is that VPNs were hastily sprung up, that RDP was sort of exposed, as Kelvin and Mike talked about. Also a huge move to Office 365. And so Office 365 was spun up very quickly, but it happened so fast, right? The second thing obviously is ransomware, as everybody talked about. The ransomware as a service is the thing that I think really is amazing to me. Brian Krebs, a security author in Boston, in America did an article about it a few weeks ago, how it's literally outsourced, how these companies are owned, and just the only thing which is preventing them from being exploited is the lack of cyber criminals. And then I think the third thing that's really going on is that budgets are tightening, that staff has been furloughed. Companies are still trying to, figure out what to do next year. What are the cybersecurity challenges that they're going to have? How many tools do I have? Do I have enough of the right tools? What are the things that I really need to help keep my company going in the coming year? So what we see as the challenge here is that the network defense goals and objectives are constantly changing. And so the need here in the market is a more resilient set of tools and a more resilient set of infrastructure. And so Cyglass, because we are a SaaS-based service, because we're a cloud-based offering, we've been able to add a whole new set of services and capabilities quite quickly to address these needs. And we think that it's quite valuable for small and medium enterprises given the uncertain times. So let me just talk a little bit about Cyglass and what we do, right? So the main thing that we were doing coming into COVID was gathering traffic from existing networking equipment, mostly firewalls, taking that traffic and sending it up into the cloud. Now, one of the things that's unique about Cyglass is that we use NetFlow. And so people may or may not be familiar with NetFlow, but NetFlow is a summarized piece of information. It's not the full message itself. It's really just the conversation. So think about it on your phone bill, the summary. Josh called Emmet. He spoke for so many minutes. What's important about that information is that it's not a lot of data. And so you can send it up to the cloud and it won't affect your network performance. The other thing is there's no PII in it. So it's really just private IP addresses, durations, flows, and things like that. And then the last thing, is it's not affected by encryption, right? So the fact that the traffic internally is encrypted doesn't affect NetFlow. So the secret sauce of Cyglass is to be able to find these anomalies primarily in this network traffic. And what we realized, though, is in addition to that, there was other pieces of information that were essential. I think Mike made an excellent point about the future of cyber being about people. And so the notion of the network really isn't just about devices and subnets, it's about who's on the network. And so the things that we've been adding is around anomaly detection, around users. So the place where a lot of users are in Active Directory or Office 365. And so getting that user activity, the user information up into Cyglass really provides an added dimension and context around anomalies. So take a use case like an account takeover. That's really about anomalous activity, strain, changes in passwords or failed logins and things like that. So these are all things that you can easily detect using this type of technique up in the cloud. And then the big thing that we've seen is really around Office 365, right? So the idea is there's a set of SaaS applications, Office 365 G Suite, where now the workforce has moved. It's no longer behind the firewall, but it's up in these SaaS applications. And again, these things were sort of thrown up hastily, and maybe you don't have all of the security controls in place. Again, this all happened so quickly. And the one thing that I would go back to, though, is there are a very important, in most companies, set of critical assets or crown jewels that are still behind the firewall. That the reason why all of these scams have been, these COVID scams have been VPN related is because there's still very critical information behind the firewall. Sometimes the domain controller, which is a target of many of these malware attacks, is actually back there. So though the perimeter is shifting and though a lot of the work is up in the cloud, firewalls are still an important piece of network security, and there's a lot of risk that needs to be managed behind that firewall. So all of this goes up into the cloud, and then you get the ability to understand, really see what's going on in your network, even though it's distributed all throughout the cloud, on-prem, multiple locations. You can take actions, and you can block and report. And really, what we've tried to do as a company is to build a solution which is like super simple, super easy, not very, even though cybersecurity is really extremely complicated, we made it easy for people to understand, easy to operate, which is important these days, given the current climate. So Cyglass is network defense as a service. We really do three things. We get you visibility into what's going on into your network. I mean, one of the things which is remarkable is that a lot of companies lack a basic understanding of what's on their network, the assets, the subnets, just basic visibility. And stopping all of these advanced cyber attacks that we're talking about require you to understand what's important, right? If we think about malware, like ransomware, the only reason why ransomware works is because bad guys get information that you care about, that you're willing to pay money for. And so you need to start by understanding where that information is so that you're securing it properly. So visibility into what's going on into your network is essential. And then stopping it, right? So threat detection and response, all of these things that the panel's been talking about, they're actually on your network for a long time, right? When bad guy gets on your network, doesn't know where he's going. So the cyber kill chain that Mike talked about, the scanning, the probing, like all of that stuff, if you know what normal looks like on your network, you can actually find and stop. And if what these guys are counting on is that you're not looking for it, you're not monitoring your network, and that they will eventually be able to gain a foothold, get privileged credentials, and then do significant damage. And so what Cyglass does, because it's monitoring your network and using artificial intelligence and machine learning to build baselines, is it can detect it and it can stop it automatically. And then the last thing that Cyglass does is it allows you to prove to people that you've got this thing under control. So many companies operate under some sort of regulatory scheme. More and more, when we think about third-party risk and supply chain, companies are being able to prove that they've got their systems under control. So whether that's a sort of local banking regulation or something more robust like NIST CSF, there's a need for companies to be able to prove that they've taken the steps required to operate safely. And so we do all of this on top of our cloud platform, right? As the diagram showed before, we run 100% up in AWS. We actually run in Dublin in the EU. So And this gives us the ability to run this solution, our Cyglass Network Defense Service, is a very affordable SaaS-based offering. And so the way that we make this easy for people is we help companies establish their network defense goals, right? So when people are deploying a solution like Cyglass, if there is a compliance driver or they're worried about ransomware, at the end of the day, there's a lot of sophistication in keeping these hybrid networks safe. And so we really, everything that we do in Cyglass is built for small, medium enterprises to be really simple, easy to understand. I mean, there's very sophisticated technology under the covers, but our goal is to make it accessible for everyone. So we allow you to establish your network defense goals. It allows you to tweak the policies that are important to you. We're offering our Office 365 capability, which we just added. I mean, this is a conversation about SaaS services and subscription models. I mean, we are a SaaS-based model. Part of the reason to have a SaaS-based offering is that the subscription gains value over time. So this is a capability that we've added at no additional license cost to be able to find anomalies in Office 365. The one thing I will say, and I'm not in the Office 365 track, a lot of the capabilities that that Microsoft offers at the E5 price. E5 is the top license, extremely expensive. We're doing this at a very affordable price, in addition to the network defense capabilities, right? It allows you to, again, we're building a baseline on activity and then alerting when something unusual happens. So account takeover, failed login attempts, all these things that you're seeing will light up like a Christmas tree. And then the last thing that we're sort of seeing is that, going back to the beginning of the year, I think there was really distinct spaces, kind of behind the firewall. There was a network detection space. There was a UEBA, like a user entity behavior analytics space. And there was a SIM space, right? And what we've seen is, and this is just in response to conversations that we're having with customers, is that the SIM space, there's a lot, SIMs are very expensive. They're costly to run. They're costly to predict how much they're gonna cost over the long term, because a lot of the pricing is like events per second. It's really complicated, and in some cases, it's more than people need. And so we've got a number of clients who are using our sort of network-based control to deliver the same type of detectives and security capabilities. And so all of this is really, as a SaaS-based offering targeted for small, medium enterprises, what we've really been doing over the last 6-8 months is evolving our solution to meet the cybersecurity challenges, many of them that the other panelists will talk about. And we think that we can do it in an affordable way because we run everything up in the cloud. There's no additional hardware or software that needs to be installed and configured. We're just taking the traffic and logs, et cetera, up from your infrastructure, sending up to our cloud, analyzing it, allowing you to configure the rules and policies that are meaningful to your business to stop them. And all of this is a very affordable and cost-effective solution. My dog Lucas is barking in the background, which must mean it's time for me to exit the stage. So, Emmet, thanks so much, and on to the next speaker.
Thanks, Josh, and hello to Lucas as well for joining us there from Boston. I gotta say, Josh, when you being on Boston time immediately made me realize just wow, we think it was a reasonably early start for all of us today, getting ready for this. It was a lot more for Josh, so thanks very much for that presentation and for staying with us for the rest of this. And our last speaker, certainly not the least, is Liviu Arsene. He is global cybersecurity researcher at Bitdefender, and Liviu is going to talk to us about new threat landscape forces organizations to update threat models. And it's quite a lengthy and verbose title, but what I think you're going to all find quite interesting. Liviu, the stage is yours. Liviu, you're on mute. Had to happen at least once in this show, folks. Don't worry.
There we go.
Excellent.
Right. So, hi everyone, and thank you for joining again. Right. So I'm Liviu. I'm a global cybersecurity researcher for Bitdefender. And hopefully for the next 10 to 20, 25 minutes maybe, we'll be taking a closer look at how the cybersecurity threat landscape has changed, at least throughout 2020, and pretty much how organizations can adapt to meet the new challenges. I'm pretty sure that I'm going to be touching a little bit on the topics that everybody previously touched on. Hopefully, I'm going to have some interesting insights as well. Apart from everything that has been discussed, I've also added some interesting findings from a recent survey that we commissioned. Findings which have actually revealed some interesting concerns among CIOs and CISOs, at least in terms of cybersecurity. Now, so before we get started, probably it would be best to say a little something about myself and my role in Bitdefender. So I've been in the security industry with Bitdefender alone for the better part of the decade now, and currently my main focus is reporting on malware outbreaks, security incidents, and forensic investigations, while pretty much at the same time coordinating with technical and research departments. So that's about it. So that said, let's see how the threat landscape has changed and at least what we can do about it. Right. So if we are to take a look at how threats have evolved over the past decades, you'll probably reach the same conclusion as the one presented in the slide in front of you. Malware pretty much started out as something developed by individual malware coders, pretty much looking to make a name for themselves or simply perform various types of scams and fraud for financial profit. Then it all changed when malware developers figured out that they can band together and put their collective skills to use by offering their services to the highest bidder. So the malware as a service business model quickly became popular as it pretty much allowed malware developers to focus more on the actual coding and feature building of their product, if you will, and less on the distribution aspect. A ransomware is actually a perfect example of how something that turned out to be profitable was taken to a completely new level by adopting an as-a-service business model. Now, again, ransomware developers wouldn't have to be bothered with distribution, but instead just focus on building those features, building the infrastructure, and even building marketing materials so that they can promote their products. So in light of all this, I guess it's actually no surprise by now that APTs seem to have followed on the same trend. If APT groups were traditionally state-sponsored and only performed politically or financially motivated attacks, recent investigations from both ourselves and other security companies, researchers, seem to reveal that all that is actually about to change. So while we're not going to dive into all of these threats throughout the session, we are going to address the last two, which are ransomware and APTs as a service. And after we're done with these, I've also prepared some interesting concerns amongst CIOs and CISOs that you'll probably find interesting as well, or at least hopefully find interesting as well. Right, so that said, ransomware is a pain. And unfortunately has been a pain for years. However, it seems that about 43% of security professionals actually agree they're seeing a resurgence in ransomware attacks. And 49% are actually concerned with a large-scale ransomware incident, potentially as a result of employees working from home. Now, interestingly, about 60% of CIOs and CISOs believe that the business they work for would actually pay the ransom in order to prevent its data or information from being published. And this is pretty much in line with everything that you've heard previously in terms of how ransomware has evolved, in the sense that it now has an extortion component, threatening the organizations to publish the stolen data unless they pay. Now, of course, if that were to happen, companies would likely face a GDPR fine as well that could significantly, be higher than the ransom note, which is exactly what cyber criminals are betting on. But neither security companies nor law enforcement actually recommend giving in to ransom demands because you would only be fueling cyber criminal activities. So it's always best, at least in my experience, to treat the incident as a hardware failure, basically, which is why companies have recovery procedures in the first place, or dare I say, should have recovery procedures in the first place. But anyway, this fear of ransomware, making a comeback and potentially affecting organizations via remote employees is not actually without merit. Since 50% of organizations did not have a plan in place for a pandemic type situation, it actually means that this fear of ransomware infections could be tied to the fact that during the reconfiguration, if you will, of business infrastructures to support remote employees, CIOs and CISOs actually fear that security gaps caused by this rapid transition may allow ransomware operators to exploit new attack vectors in order to, successfully compromise businesses. So basically, what I'm trying to say is, in a nutshell, is that CIOs and CISOs expect to see more ransomware incidents, potentially because not all companies were prepared for remote work, and as a result of on-the-fly infrastructure realignment, where security gaps would have been created that ransomware operators will likely exploit. Now, looking at our own telemetry throughout the first half of 2020, we found that the total number of global ransomware reports increased 7-fold year over year, potentially suggesting that threat actors upped their ransomware campaigns, potentially in an effort to capitalize on both the pandemic and the work from home context, as well as the commodization, if you will, of ransomware as a service. However, looking at the monthly evolution of business ransomware reports, the figures that you're actually seeing on the screen, while the number of actual reports seems to have remained somewhat constant, we've seen more coverage in the media than before the pandemic about companies being affected by ransomware. So I would argue that it's not just a matter of the number of ransomware reports that have increased, but also a matter of the increased success rate of these ransomware attacks as well. Looking at the monthly evolution of business ransomware reports, while the numbers might have remained steadily or even dropped a couple of percentage points during each specific month, these success rates for these campaigns might be higher than before the pandemic, especially because of the now remote workforce and potential misconfigurations in business infrastructure that have been deployed or that have been exploited actually by threat actors. Now, we're done with ransomware, so the second topic would be basically APTs. Now, the first sign that foretold APT hackers for hire were actually in early 2020. So earlier this year, when we found very interesting RDP, remote desktop protocol brute forcing module being distributed by the TrickBot Trojan, which, by the way, in a recent operation from Microsoft and law enforcement, seems to have been dismantled, or at least partially. We're still seeing signs of that activity. In fact, we just actually published some new findings on how TrickBot operators are actually trying to re-engineer, if you will, their entire infrastructure to make it more resilient to these types of takedowns. So you're more than welcome to check out that blog post on labs.bitdefender.com. But anyway, what made this particular module interesting was that it conducted remote desktop brute forcing operations on select targets or IP addresses that seemed to belong to victims in the US and Hong Kong, victims who operate in the telecom industry. Now, seeing a garden variety Trojan, if you will, that's mostly consumer oriented, going after a highly select list of targets in the US and Hong Kong, targets that operate in the telecom industry. Now this is something that you don't usually see every day. Basically, we hypothesized at the time, although we had absolutely no tangible forensic evidence to back up the theory, that if an APT group would be interested in compromising a high-value target while at the same time remaining anonymous, this could be one way of doing it. Leveraging an existing infrastructure for a garden variety Trojan and then just planting a component that does the work for them. In our next investigation, we found an interesting incident in which the Chaffer APT group, known to have an apparent Iranian link, actually conducted campaigns targeting air transportation and government in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. Now, the end goal for both attacks was likely data exploration and exfiltration, pretty much because they used tactics and techniques suggested that, custom tools, living off the land tactics, and spearfishing as an initial attack vector are pretty much on par with the capabilities that we've unfortunately grown accustomed to when seeing these types of attacks. We also investigated another group that is known as bitter APT, and we actually found evidence that it has some political affiliation. Now, the group seems to have had campaigns both in 2014 and 2019, which interestingly were election years in the regions that it targeted. So, there's a high chance that the bitter APT group could be state-sponsored as well. But perhaps one of the most, let's call it interesting developments in the behavior of APT groups actually occurred when we investigated an APT group named Strong Pity that has been targeting victims in Turkey and Syria using a watering hole tactic to selectively infect victims. While this group has been known to target victims in Belgium, Italy, this particular attack that we investigated focused on the Kurdish community in Turkey and Syria, and seems to have actually coincided with a Turkish military operation. If I remember correctly, October 1st, 2019 was the date for both when the Turkish military operation started and the timestamp on the Strong Pity samples that we analyzed throughout the investigation. But the most conclusive sign that supports the hypothesis of APT groups that have moved to a mercenary type business model is actually a recent investigation involving a cyber espionage attack targeting an international architecture and video production company. Weird, right? So the tactic used, basically the used tactics and techniques actually point to an APT style attack, and yet when we took a look at took a step back and looked at the investigation, there were actually no signs of political or financial motivation behind it. So here's what we found about this particular attack. The cybercriminal group actually infiltrated the company using a tainted and specially crafted plugin for a very popular software widely used in 3D computer graphics. But just days prior to us actually releasing the report with the investigation, Autodesk, the 3D software that was targeted, actually released an advisory warning that a vulnerability involving a tainted plugin, just like the one that we investigated, could be used to take control of a victim's system. So this basically means that when this particular company was targeted, attackers used a zero-day vulnerability to compromise the company. Now, traditionally, this type of sophistication and resources behind or being used in an attack are only spotted in high-profile companies, not an architectural company. So industrial espionage is nothing new, and since the real estate industry is highly competitive, with contracts valued at billions of dollars, I assume that the stakes can sometimes be really high for winning contracts for luxury projects. And while it may not be legitimate, they could justify turning to APT groups for gaining a negotiation advantage, if you will. Right. So, what does this mean? What does this mean for companies? Well, I guess it basically means bad news, and could potentially mean open season for small and mid-sized companies. Threat models that factored in state-sponsored actors and advanced actors were mostly on the agenda for large companies and government infrastructures. The commodization, if you will, of APT hackers for hire means that any company, regardless of its size or vertical, could potentially be facing APT-like sophisticated attacks bent on industrial espionage. So one of the biggest fears for IT and security decision makers is that their company could be targeted by APT groups. So, if in the past most APT level breaches on SMBs were part of supply chain attacks, APT mercenaries offering their services to the highest bidder could practically mean that small and mid-sized companies could be facing threats more sophisticated than they're actually prepared to deal with. And all this could be indicative that APT hackers for hire are becoming, the new norm, because their presence and action seems to pop up in other security research as well, not just our own. And by the way, if you're looking for more information about the overall threat landscape for any type of organizations, for businesses, and how threats have evolved after the pandemic or throughout the pandemic, we have a new business threat landscape report entitled "The New Normal State of Cybersecurity," which you're you're more than welcome to check out. We have tons of information about statistics. We have graphics. We have trends that we've spotted throughout this year. So you're more than welcome to check that out as well. And of course, more information about APT. APT is becoming a service, being offered as a service. Right. So earlier in the presentation, I promised that we'll also be discussing something else rather than ransomware, and APTs as a service. So let's just see what that is, and why is it such a big concern for CIOs and CISOs. Right. So while APT mercenaries, may be part of the new threat landscape, another risk to organizations, at least a risk perceived by security decision makers, relates to the state of cyber warfare, at least according to over 60% of CIOs and CISOs. So I guess it seems that, contrary to popular belief, the coronavirus outbreak is not actually one of their biggest fears, but cyber warfare is. We all remember how Stuxnet operated. But there have also been more recent incidents in which cyber warfare was actually blamed for attacks on electrical power grids in the US, Russia, and even Ukraine. And we've also seen examples where cyber warfare was actually met with kinetic military response. If I remember correctly, just last year, Israel responded to a cyber attack by destroying a building associated with an ongoing cyber attack. Although, I don't think that security decision makers, CIOs and CISOs worry about having their office visited by a cruise missile, I do think that they worry about being collateral victims in sophisticated malware like this. Now, the reason that 63% of InfoSec professionals believe that cyber warfare is actually a threat to their organization can somewhat be easy to figure out. It could be either because of the increase of security reports investigating targeted attacks on critical or commercial infrastructure, or it could be because of statements from governments that have actually become more vocal and prone to singling out specific countries, at least when attributing potential cyber attacks that occurred on public or private infrastructure. Now, of course, there's also the fact that dependency on technology is actually at an all-time high. And if someone were to take out an internet connection in a home or office, no one would actually be able to get anything done. And, this dependency wasn't there a few years back, and it wasn't even as high a few months back. The reason why 27% of InfoSec professionals don't currently have a strategy in place to protect against cyber warfare is likely because, dare I say it, complacency. Since they haven't suffered an attack or haven't seen on a wide scale the damage that can be done, they haven't invested the time in protecting against it. Now, of course, having a team a team with diverse skill sets is actually instrumental in building an effective security strategy that's capable of detecting, investigating, and even hunting threat actors. So naturally, about 72% of decision makers believe that skill set diversity is actually what's needed to address the fear of becoming a collateral victim in cybersecurity. And since APT threat actors are inherently the most diverse, or actually the correct term is neurodiverse bunch out there, it's probably time to take a page from their book and apply the same neurodiversity to security teams. And it actually seems that this fear regarding the state of cyber warfare seems to have been well placed. Just a couple of weeks ago, if I remember correctly, the US actually charged Russian military intelligence service officers who are believed to have been behind thousands of attacks on US and international corporations, organizations, political campaigns, and parties, and even foreign governments. The indictment actually had a long list of victims targeted by the group, including Ukraine, the US, and France, even targeting the political campaign of the now French President Emmanuel Macron. The indictment also claimed that this particular group also targeted international and government organizations investigating the poisoning of a former Russian military intelligence service officer and his daughter in the United Kingdom through a series of spear phishing campaigns in 2018, in which they targeted the Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, I believe, and the UK's Defence Science and Technology Laboratory. So this is all fascinating, how an APT group can be indicted like that. So I guess in light of all this, it actually makes sense why security CIOs and CISOs, security decision makers, actually fear cyber warfare so much. Not because they fear becoming a direct target for the state-sponsored actor, but because of the implications such attacks or these attacks would have or on their organization if they were collateral victims. Again, a cyber attack on power grids, internet providers, or any critical infrastructure could indirectly disturb an organization's performance, which is why CIOs and CISOs apparently lose sleep over every night trying to figure out ways to ensure business continuity in case these scenarios should occur. Right. So before signing off, this is my last slide. I guess the top takeaways regarding what I wanted to point out so far revolved around APT hackers for hire now becoming part of the threat landscape, and it's likely that small and mid-sized businesses will have to reassess their threat models because of it. Also, now that the entire workforce is remote, companies face new risk factors and attack vectors that they wouldn't have even considered 12 months ago. Employees are actually now considered a major cause for breaches, including their devices and infrastructure. Everything they have within their homes, IoTs, and even their own personal off-the-shelf routers. Cyber warfare as well seems to be a top priority for security decision makers, not because they fear they'll be directly targeted, but because of the indirect effects an attack on a country's critical infrastructures might have on their business. If before the pandemic, people were sitting in an office building, it had backup generators, they had a satellite connection in case the primary internet connection went down. Now everybody's working remotely and pretty much depends on this critical infrastructure. And while the cloud is still there, it still operates, it still gets the job done, it will probably be employees that will be the most affected by these potential cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, which is why that's why CIOs and CISOs lose sleep over and worry about cyber warfare. Now, there's hope in facing all these challenges, at least partially. And that hope comes in the form of, at least from my experience recently, in the form of using the MITRE framework to pretty much map out threats and APTs and even help you assess and address the security blind spots in your security stack. For example, MITRE has actually become the go-to standard for mapping out threats, but it can also help organizations actually identify which technologies are missing from their security stack whenever they're investigating an attack. For example, if they figure out that they lack the security technologies to detect file-based or fileless attacks, actually, like we heard previously, then that means that they need to address that specific issue. If the attacker managed to get a fileless-based attack during a specific time in the attack lifecycle that was mapped to the MITRE framework, then that means your organization basically needs some sort of technologies that can address that. So that's one way of using MITRE. And I guess, with that, that's all from my side. And hopefully I've actually managed to sit across some relevant insights. Let's see if we have any questions.
And thank you, Liviu, for a fascinating and at times absolutely terrifying presentation, I think it's reasonable to say. So we have now reached the Q&A portion of proceedings. So before we get going, just pleased to ask all our panelists from so far to unmute themselves because, you never know when I'm going to be coming to you. And to you, those who are joining us and have really enjoyed, I'm sure, the last hour of presentations, please keep your questions coming in. I've got plenty to ask the chaps myself, but we want to hear from you and get your thoughts across. There is one I just need to bring up to make sure that Matthew knows you received it. Matthew Bruton has asked about the slides being distributed afterwards. Matthew, I'm going to check with the folks behind it. I don't have the answer to that directly, but we will get an answer for you on that. And the first question that I have, I'm going to go back to Josh. And Josh, you were talking a lot about zero trust and the likes during that. So is that really something that I should be thinking about more? Because I think it is an area that sort of stands out to me. And I suppose why should I be thinking about it more? Is the best way of putting it.
Yeah, I mean, so it's a good question, Emmett. I mean, I think zero trust is a little bit of topic du jour. There's been a lot of marketing messages really about it. I mean, at its center is identity, right? Knowing, kind of similar to what Mike was saying, like getting a view on your network, which is really or your company, which is about people, and then services and devices. And so I think that we've sort of been flung forward with the cloud without sort of, with maybe skipping some of the basic steps. So I do think people should be thinking about it, but I think it starts with some foundational work, which is really like understanding what you have, right? At the end of the day, like if you don't know what's supposed to be on your network, who's supposed to be on your network, what the services are in your network, then you cannot build a set of rules and policies that say this service should or should not talk to this other service. So I think it's a sort of easier said than done. But if you're doing some basic cyber hygiene, like understanding what's on your network and who's on your network, then I think you're off to a strong and reasonable start.
Thanks, Josh. And Kelvin, it's been a while since we heard from you, but good to have you back. How are you doing, Kelvin?
Yeah, it's good to be back.
Great stuff. Kelvin, I'm going to immediately sour the tone a bit. So, as you were saying in your presentation, ransomware can literally kill, given what it can affect in hospitals. But of course, when it comes to sort of big deal stuff, the things that basically are more likely to scare people, obviously their natural reaction is to sort of go revert to thinking, surely he's overplaying it, like surely he can't be that risky. How do we get that greater focus on the risk without people thinking we're overplaying it, I suppose?
Yeah, the bad thing about ransomware and the bad thing about these attacks is most people aren't saying that they're paying the money either. We've seen the US government being hit many, many times over the last 2 years. The state of Louisiana declared an emergency, a federal emergency. And all of these little governances, just to give you one example, are paying them. And they're paying them because the insurance companies are saying, listen, it's easier to pay these ransomware guys now. Maybe give them $500,000 instead of paying $2 million in fixing all those things we have to fix. So it's a kind of a quick fix for things. So I was saying, would start with the CISO, start with the people on the top. If you need to talk to these guys and you need to show them how much they are in the firing line themselves, but also as well, if they were on the golf course, that's a terrible cliche to use, but if they were on the golf course with somebody, a friend of theirs that it happened to, it would kind of bring it home to them. I would get some of the news articles. There's some from Ireland, there's some from England, there's some from anywhere in the US you could get, and just show them that it is real. And there is the stats out there from companies like the companies we've heard today. It is real. You don't have to go far to find stuff to scare people. It's real out there, and it's bigger than. I never hear about it in the news, for instance, and I don't really understand why, because it is the number one threat to businesses is cyber threats. So, as far as crime goes.
If I just you want to jump in there,
if I can jump in a little bit, ransomware is a multi-billion-dollar business, and it's definitely generating a lot of profit for these guys. Mostly, just like Kelvin mentioned, some victims actually pay behind the scenes, which is something that we do not recommend. Of course, it's a business decision whether you want to give in to ransomware incidents or not. But sometimes it can cost you twice as much giving in to the ransomware demand, paying the actual ransom, and then the operational costs for redeploying your infrastructure again, recovering it, and making the man hours that your IT team spends to recover all those encrypted files, and then the time spent to bring back your infrastructure basically to an operational fashion. So that means you're basically spending twice for what you should be doing only once, recovering from a backup, if you have a sufficiently resilient backup and recovery procedure. So you should also factor in that when you assess whether or not you want to pay given the ransomware demand, that you might end up basically paying twice the amount.
And Mike, you mentioned WannaCry during your talk. That brought me back, because I remember exactly where I was when that all happened. I was in work for 2 days that week, only the Monday, Tuesday, because I was going away on holiday for the rest of it. And it led to all sorts of things, because, of course, the scale of WannaCry meant, I had to somehow manage it while technically on holiday. And it was a busman's holiday. I was covering a basketball tournament in Istanbul. So I'm managing our coverage of that while in the middle of this crazy mixed zone, trying to get everything sorted. We got it done in the end. It had triple the size of our normal tech section. It was great. But when WannaCry happened, there was, showing the scale of it, there was that feeling that these types of breaches were now mainstream. They were a thing that regular people, for want of a way of phrasing it, would care about. Like those of us that been in the game though a while, also knew that this didn't mean things were necessarily going to change. And it's been over 3 years now. Has anything really changed in terms of corporate attitudes to enforcing the necessary protections, really?
I do think attitudes have changed. I had, is it the fortune? I actually went to, forgive the obvious pun here, I went to what was patient zero in the NHS, the first place it was discovered, nearly 12 months later, and I'm not going to name and shame, but they were NHS Digital was sent in as in response to this, and they came up with a 12-point plan. It was 10 months later when I went in, and they delivered 3 of them. And they were the obvious things. There were things like strong passwords. There were things like patch management and the like. So I do think attitudes have changed. I do also think that there has been a little bit of it'll never happen to me. Particularly in the SMB market that we've been talking about this morning, that people don't think they're big enough. And if you watch it was the BBC Panorama program afterwards that made it look like the NHS were targeted. They weren't. I think everybody here will say the same thing. WannaCry did not target the NHS. They were just the biggest victim of it, because they were stuck in a set of circumstances where let's call it their business, wasn't able to keep pace with commercial business in terms of patching and management of the systems with which they use. Just means they needed to put other measures in place to protect themselves, the more traditional layers of perimeter security and cloud services. So to answer your question, yes, attitudes have changed, but there's still a stubborn element of it'll never happen to me.
And if I may, again, sorry for keep interrupting. What Mike says is actually quite true. I was actually looking at our own business telemetry recently and found, from our business clients, and found that about over 65% of all unpatched vulnerabilities are older than 2018 and stretch back to 2002. So you have systems that have decades of vulnerabilities that haven't been unpatched. And some of those systems, now with the entire work from home situation and infrastructure realignment to pretty much accommodate for remote connection, that means that some of those unpatched systems may now be facing the internet. If traditionally they were behind firewalls and stuff like that, and policies and stuff like that, these could become a problem in the next 12 to 18 months. And I'm pretty sure that even if you do an online sweep to see, to check for vulnerabilities, for public IP addresses for companies, you'll actually find you'll have a very big surprise, especially now that there's, again, 60 to 65% of unpatched systems have vulnerabilities older than 2018, which is insane.
Well, I'm going to stay with you, Liviu, on this one, but I'm going to ask all the other panelists to answer this as well after you've answered it. And that's, Liviu, you mentioned there's an increased rate of success for ransomware during the pandemic. So, what do businesses really need to do to make remote as safe as the office? Because I suppose we're not, even when, some sort of form of normalcy returns, an awful lot of people are still going to be working remotely. That risk is still going to be out there. So if we want to make sure that my wonderful chateau here is as safe as my own desk in work, what do I need to do to make sure that I'm not a threat inadvertently?
Tough. 50% of businesses, just like I mentioned in the presentation, 50% of businesses did not have a pandemic type situation plan. So they did not have a plan in which to accommodate their entire workforce going remotely. So that means their infrastructure from the start, they really had to do a lot of modifications overnight, literally overnight. People were burning the midnight oil to make sure that starting the next day, 100% of their employees can connect to the infrastructure. And that alone opens up a huge amount of potential attack vectors. We're not talking just about patches. We're talking about policies for one. So this is the biggest thing that I've seen. A lot of these policies, at least during the first couple of months, were not changed. Some of those policies actually took into account network appliances like firewalls or web application firewalls that were deployed within the corporate infrastructure. And once the endpoints were moved outside the corporate infrastructure, those policies no longer apply. So most endpoints actually did not have deployed within the endpoint the right security stack, let alone the policies that can ensure that at least they're going on the same security level as before the pandemic, or as when the endpoints were within the corporate infrastructure. And that's one of the things. Secondly, I'm pretty sure by now that a lot of organizations have moved to VPNs and have moved to multi-factor authentications. Hopefully, if not, well, maybe you should do that. A lot of CIOs and CISOs actually expect within the next 12 to 18 months to see an increase in potential incidents within their organizations. Right now, they just don't know what they don't know because of these migrations. And third, actually, is train your employees. I couldn't stress this enough. I mean, before the pandemic, you already had on your endpoint a fairly sufficient security stack of technologies being deployed, anti-malware and stuff like that. But now it's also about the human risk component. So you need to make sure that employees know what types of threats your organizations are facing or is facing. Make them sure that they can identify spear phishing emails, or like Kelvin said, those types of emails impersonating the CFO, the finance director, or the legal department and stuff like that. BEC scams. So make sure that your employees are sufficiently trained in following these, in identifying these scams, and in following proper reporting procedures. When we were in an office, you had the benefit of going with your laptop next to the IT guy and saying, hey, I've received this email. Now you're working from home, and maybe you might not want to talk to your IT guy who's constantly brushing you off saying, I've got bigger fires to put out than your spear phishing email. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to chip in there briefly to agree with everything that Liviu said, but if you're in an office, you're cocooned in all of these things. You've got firewalls, you've got DNS, you've got your corporate network, corporate shares. Even if somebody wants to walk into your office, you've probably got a secretary or a security guard making sure they don't walk in and steal some stuff. When you go home, there's none of that there. So it's working from home is kind of like moving to a new office, but not bringing all of your security along with you. So when you look at dodgy Internet of Things devices, most people's routers, for instance, the ISPs are set up really bad as well. I think 2021, you're going to see criminals really move into that space and exploit all of that dodgy home security. And there's much effort that has to be put into it, all more than had to be put into setting up your office previously. And things are going to have to change quite a bit.
And Josh, I see you somewhat cocooned in the gorgeous morning light there in Boston. So when it came to your own co-workers, what was it like just, making sure when you all went home that you yourselves were as secure in your houses as you would have been in your office beforehand?
Yeah, I mean, we lived the rapid deployment of VPNs. I actually went back into the office a few weeks after COVID hit, and I was like, "What are all these cables lying around? Like who leaves the lab like this, right?" And you realize people are literally recabling the VPN and then heading out the door. So we definitely lived through that. I mean, I echo the advice, the other panels. The only other thing I would say there is with VPNs, governments are saying you got to monitor and you got to look for anomalies there, right? These are now a route to the crown jewels. And so IT staff, security staffs are already super busy, but, monitoring the VPN for weird things like, Josh, and you need something which is anomaly based, not policy based, because people are working at weird times. People are working from weird places. So you need something that says, wow, it's really unusual for Josh to log in from, California, because I'm in Boston, right? But, so anomaly-based detection for VPNs is big. And then the other way to sort of think about this problem is a sort of risk-based view, right? What are the really important things? Like, you can't do everything. So like, what's essential? Where is it? And do you have a set of controls around that? And some of that stuff is going to be in the office still. The Active Directory, the domain controllers, the things everybody goes after. So make sure that thing is safe. But it could also be up in the cloud. And so again, securing everything is a real challenge for small, medium enterprises. So just like understand what's really important to you take a sort of risk assessment, and then focus your controls on those things. Would be my my advice there.
And Mike, what have you been telling your clients?
So I'll bring front and center something everybody's mentioned, and if there's one place to spend your money right now that is going to have the biggest increase in security posture that you could possibly have, it's MFA. The one thing everybody wants are your credentials. If you've got those, I can jump on a VPN. If you're an elevated privileges, then I can open up backdoors into my network. If you protect that set of credentials, then you're protecting all your cloud systems, all your on-premise solutions, even the laptop that sat in front of us that you took home. It can be encrypted, but if there's a post-it note next to it, somebody can get on there and jump onto a network. So you want to put that in, and the cost effectiveness for the benefit you're going to get is probably the one that you should do first. There are a couple other bits and pieces that you should consider, but do that one first. People forget about Wi-Fi. It's a dirty little secret in security that we need to consider Wi-Fi security. What am I logging on to? We've talked a little bit about home users, and people popping up with home networks and that BT Home Hub or whatever it is lying around in your house that you're connecting to. They're vulnerable, so we need to give consideration to Wi-Fi. And there are plenty of solutions out there where you can fix your Wi-Fi. And then there's kind of the last one, I think, is segmentation, and it kind of goes back to the first question you asked me about people's attitudes, and they're changed. Segmentation, network segmentation is there for a reason. Stop, go through another set of changes before being able to transverse from one secure system to another. Observations such as Josh has talked about, knowing what normal looks like is very important. But those three things, I think, are going to help you.
And as Mike was saying there, the Wi-Fi one, there's some very easy, simple tests you can do yourself, by the way, folks, in order to wonder if your Wi-Fi security is adequate. A great one I find is if you can access your work applications on a Starbucks network, you need to work on your Wi-Fi security. And so that's a very simple one, but believe me, it's worth checking. So Kelvin, you mentioned something which I think is quite fascinating. I've heard it before, but is one I want to go into a bit of detail of. You mentioned professional nature of the operations of some cybercrime gangs. They go 9 to 5. They probably have a HR department. Some of them might even have health insurance. When you're this blatant, I suppose, you basically have an office to check in and check out of. Is it not surely a failing in the parts of the conventional authorities that these sort of companies, basically criminal companies, can operate effectively in plain sight?
Yeah, definitely. You look at something like the Zeus network, where ransomware was kind of born out of, and then you look at the big gangs today, whether they're Emotech, TrickBot, etc. They're operating in countries where they're allowed to operate. And like I say, if we take apart their code, it might say, if the keyboard is in this country, do not run. And if the keyboard is in this country, run. So a lot of the malware out there is just made to run in a certain location. And a lot of countries are guilty of this. I think in the case of, say, Emotech or whatever, it's mostly based out of Russia, but a lot of countries are guilty of this as well, turning a blind eye to when criminals act in a country where they mightn't be too friendly with. So, that's a big problem. It's happening so much now that government and healthcare are being hit in 2020. I think that's one of my predictions for 2021. You're going to see this on the highest stage of the UN and on all these places where the political talking heads go. You're going to see people calling it out a lot more. Before, governments were hiding behind cyber criminals and saying it wasn't us, but the damage and just the money that's being made is getting too big for it not to be mentioned on the highest stage. So yeah, that's one thing I will expect over the next year. If you think it's going to be peace between all the powers in the world and they're going to get together and do anything, I'd still be very pessimistic about it. But I think you're going to hear a lot of talking with that in the coming year.
Well, we're going to stay terrifying for a second then. I'm going to go back to Liviu. Liviu, you mentioned that it would after the likely end goal was data access, but you showed a few other different types of attacks. And I suppose, can these types of cyber attacks and ransomware and the likes really be advanced to evolve what we think of as warfare today? Because I'm thinking people getting access to drones or anything else that involves basically a computer, which is most military operations. kind of crazy, kind of scary.
Okay, so we have actually a saying around the office. If you have 3 lines of code, one of them is probably a vulnerability. So basically, everything that runs any type of software, any piece of software, regardless if it's low-level, firmware type software, or if it's an OS layer piece of code, it's pretty much susceptible to vulnerabilities for one. So types of attack are actually unrestricted. They're mostly motivated by intent. So they're financially motivated, they're politically motivated. If you're a target, if somebody wants something from you badly, they will find a way. Now, the downside to this is that what we've seen is a sort of commodization of tools, of APT tools, if you will. There's so many open source hacking tools. There's so much information at your disposal by simply doing a Google search or visiting some obscure dark web forum where you can get everything just a click away. Plus, you have services like obfuscation as a service, where you basically create your own piece of malware, you send it across to some guys, and they just repackage it to make sure that it bypasses existing security solutions. And they actually guarantee that the security solution will not detect it for a specific time interval, for 1 hour or 2 hours, and you pay for this specific service also. The malware as a service industry is insane. If the security industry would move as fast and be as profitable as the malware as a service industry, it would be quite interesting. But unfortunately, it doesn't. So my advice to you is, regardless of the size of company, the size of the company that you're having. For example, if you're an SMB, let's start with SMB. If you find yourself in a position where you don't have the manpower, you don't have the technologies, you don't have the expertise to address this new threat landscape, there are solutions for you. For example, you don't have to invest a lot in a SOC, Systems Operations Center, when you can turn to MDR services, which, by the way, Gartner actually says it's one of the most expansive markets out there. So you can basically hire security help. If you feel you don't have the necessary security stack or the necessary visibility stack across your entire infrastructure, whether that infrastructure is on-premise, cloud, or hybrid, or any type of infrastructure, again, there are solutions out there. What's important is that you do a proper assessment of your infrastructure. You know what your critical assets are. You know basically what you have to protect yourself from, and then start building a business case from there. So security is an organic thing. It's a live thing. So it's just like a living organism. It will constantly require adapting.
And we're going to bring this down a bit more relatable. I don't mean that in terms of sort of the security threats that Liviu mentioned, but I meant more, having gone with the threats of nukes and drones, I'm going with the more fundamental threats for Josh. And Josh, that's like, sort of the basics of ransomware protection, really. Like, because when it comes to just, trying to make sure you're less of a target, that you're less likely to be someone that ransomware criminals pursue. Where do I start to protect myself to make sure that, I want to make sure, but to increase the chances that I'm not going to be targeted?
Yeah, I mean, I think Liviu, he had this really on the slide, right? And we talked about RDP and keeping RDP secure. I mean, I think, one of the honestly, the challenges for SMEs is, how many tools and how many of the right tools, right? I mean, so teams are only so big, they can only do so much. And I think that's one of the challenges that I'm hearing and talking to customers is, so what do I do, right? So my team's only so big and these tools that I have. And I just think there's a recognition that the cyber staff is kind of what it's hard to get people. So you got to train and invest in your people, and you got to give them a reasonable set of tools that they can run. Like a human being, how many tools of these, could they possibly run? 2, 3, 5? Like 5 feels like too many to actually ask them to run and to keep these networks safe. So I think the thing that companies need to be figuring out with this sort of risk-based view is like, what are the important things for me to protect? And then, like, given the team that I have, like, what are the right number of tools that I can possibly run? And it may mean a little bit of rationalization at looking what you have. I mean, budgets are also tight, right? And so earlier in my career, I spent a lot of time selling to the biggest enterprises in the world, and they had every tool and every team, and they were massive, right? And so one of the really hard challenges for medium enterprises is my team is not vast. I mean, I think outsourcing is a possibility at time, but you can't outsource the risk, right? The risk is still yours, and so you can get other people to come in and help you, but your core team has really got to be able to get things done. And so I just think, besides the sort of techniques that we sort of talked about here, is I would encourage everybody to sort of just take a step back, risk-based approach, critical piece of infrastructure, and then like, given my team, what are the tools that I have to run within my budgets to keep things safe? I mean, I know that the threat landscape is vast and increasing, but given COVID, like budgets are really tight. And so I just think about sort of efficiency, both with staff and tools, is really going to be the key to success going forward.
And before I actually ask Mike for his thoughts on that, just to remind all of you who are watching in, please get your questions in. We're towards the tail end of this now. I'll soon be asking the guys for their final thoughts. But if you want to get a question in, now is the time to get it in. Mike, what are you telling people to give themselves the fundamentals of ransomware protection?
Yeah, so one of the things we did earlier this year was we did a survey with SC Magazine. And we asked clients what was preventing them from putting the measures in place that they clearly knew they needed to do. And there were three key messages that came out. Time, this won't surprise anybody, by the way. They've always been there, but they're a little bit more precious at the moment. Time, money, skills. They're the things that are stopping people from, they know they need to do something better. So how can they address those? And it was touched on by Josh there. So in this marketplace that we're discussing, this SMB market, you might have an IT manager. He might know a bit about networks, or he's probably better on the desktop than he is the network, or vice versa. It's very difficult to have the broad set of skills to run an IT environment for an SMB. So find somebody you can work with that you can trust. We all work with resellers. We work with each other. We build integrations between each other's products here, so that we can do this. But we have communities out there, partners that we will all work with who are expert matters in these areas. And they can bring skills to bear that will take the pain away. The risk remains with the end user, of course it does. But they can put appropriate due diligence in with those partners with which they choose to work. Equally, by doing so, they can change their consumption model. So if we look at money being one of the inhibitors, by working with organizations who are subject matter experts, they quite often do this on a monthly payment scheme, for example. So instead of having these big projects, you consume it on a monthly payment model that's more palatable in the current climate. And the thing I keep telling everybody about this is where you work with a partner, their experience goes beyond you. They probably, they might have hundreds of clients, they might have 10 clients, but they probably experience what you're trying to achieve elsewhere, and we can bring the skills and experience they learned there to bear for you, which means you can deploy the solution in a more timely manner, as well as learn from the previous experience that you've already had elsewhere.
And Mike, I'm going to stay with you because you said something at the very top of your talk, which really, really gave me a right smile. You mentioned how most people have somewhere between 6 to 9 passwords. I thought you were being generous there, to be honest.
Yeah.
But this is one of those. This is one of those habits which, because I come back to this, we've all got varying degrees of experience between in the security game and how long we've been covering it and the likes. My beard does post-date that my start, put it that way. But Mike, it's one of those fundamental things where it's a human thing of, well, I just don't have time. I just don't have that much mental space to control it. So how do we, I suppose, get people to take MFA as being an easy to use thing? Because it is quite easy, but how do we sort of get that across that there is this? It's as easy as trying to remember 6 passwords, basically.
How do we get it? Well, the only way to get it across is one, remind them that they're actually doing it already. Everybody here, your bank is forcing you to do it now. Yeah. This when you can see it with the virtual background. You know, when we're trying to log on to a bank to do anything, we're already doing MFA. You're probably using your thumb, you might be using your iris, you might be using some code in order to get into the device. And then you need something else before you're allowed to do it. So the end user experience is not unfamiliar to them, but they perhaps don't know it as MFA.
And so as Liviu, that's one of the things, is like making people realize that, like, you know, because we have so many acronyms and terms in what we do, is that, like, listen, this is a thing you're already doing. You just do it in a different part of your life.
Yeah, exactly. So going back to passwords, we looked at our telemetry again and found that about 93% of all business employees reuse their passwords. 93%. So that is a lot.
7% are lying, let's be honest.
93%, I'm not lying, honest to God.
No, I said the other 7% are lying.
Oh, the other 7%, yeah, definitely. So when we approached clients and our own internal staff, we actually set up a policy saying, okay, so you need to change your passwords every 30 or 60 days, but also we set up a new policy saying that your current password does not have to match with any of your previously used passwords. So you basically have to contain a hash list of all the password that you've used in the past, just to make sure that you force employees to come up with a new password, even if it is that they add another one or 1, 2, 3, 4, and the 6 next month. So just make sure that you do that. But yeah, the issue of multi-factor authentication is tricky, especially now in a work from home situation. And what companies need to realize is that the lack of enforcing these policies could open them up to data breaches that may force them to pretty much, you know, close the business down. We've seen, just like Kelvin mentioned, we've seen businesses in which successful ransomware incident pretty much shut them down completely. It doesn't have to be a ransomware incident. All it has to be is just a password that's stolen, or that an attacker that does some sort of credential stuffing attacks with passwords that the employee has previously used, and it's game over from there on. And if he's in the infrastructure, your company is at risk. So and that should be the argument. You know, address the human component. The weakest link in the cybersecurity chain often sits between the chair and the keyboard. So address that.
And Kelvin, Liviu was making me think there about the way that sort of some systems, it's like, you know, every 90 days you got to change the password. My general thinking of that as well, it means for roughly 1 day every 90 days, those people's accounts are probably safe. So for you, when it comes to getting people to be a bit wiser about what they do, like, what do you tell your customers?
I've been banging on about it. I'd say security P, first of all. Sort your passwords out. We all know what we need to do for passwords. Try to have them over a certain amount of digits, probably 10, I think it is. A certain amount of complexity, multi-factor authentication. That's 2 big things away. And we've been saying this stuff since the 80s. Update everything. Like, that's important now when you have smart toasters, but it was important back in the day when you had, like, you know, really old Unix servers or whatever. And yeah, it hasn't really changed, but it has changed at the same time. Password policy has always been important, but now it includes things like multi-factor authentication. Updates have always been important, but now you want to update a broader range of devices. And yeah, passwords, and getting obviously security software and things like that as well. As the guys were saying, security awareness training has been the big thing. It's always been really important, but with things like BC scams and that type of thing, it's been pretty massive. And as I was saying in my presentation, as well as training people, try to put them on their toes by testing them out as well. Why not ring them up with a fake guy and try to put through a fake invoice? Why not send them an email saying that you're going to give them free food, like has happened to one of our employees. She was offered some free meal out of our kitchen and got caught out. But yeah, it's good to keep people on their toes, and it's better to be caught out and embarrassed a little bit by your IT department than to be caught out and embarrassed by some super criminal halfway across the world.
And I'm going to get the last word on this, and pretty much for the whole presentation to Josh, because Josh, you're a dog owner. I'm guessing one of the first things you're going to say to people is not the dog's name as your password.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, being smart about passwords, using a password manager. I mean, I do think the human element of this is really at the at the center, right? So the one thing I would just say though is empathy. I mean, it's very easy to sort of finger wag and say, oh my gosh, you did a silly thing with your password or whatever. We're people up here, I mean, smarter than me, real cybersecurity experts. Not everybody who works in these IT shops are. So I would just say a little bit of empathy, a little bit of understanding, patience. This stuff is really, really complicated. And so whatever we can do to sort of encourage people to sort of do the right thing, be kind and supportive is ultimately the best way to get people to sort of do these things. Catch more flies with
I'd agree with Josh
with honey and all that. Yeah,
I'd agree with Josh there as well. Not to focus on failure, not to sack people just because you made a mistake. Put your arms around that guy and say, this is ultimately our mistake where we went wrong, and just see every mistake as an opportunity to fix the process as opposed to
particularly when something bad happens, right? That's the time when you got to be sort of calm and measured and understanding, and blame-free postmortems after the fact. But this is hard stuff for everyone, and so just like being patient and empathetic is how we'll sort of all find a way to get through it.
That's fantastic. I would like to thank Liviu, Arsene, Mike Pensible, Josh Bregman, and Kelvin, whose surname I've forgotten. Sorry about that. For joining me, Kelvin Murray, and thanks all four for joining me. Thank all of you for tuning in throughout our wonderful talk here and a great couple of hours of chat about cybersecurity. And I hope you enjoyed the rest of your conference. And for now, goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay.
you.